Hello, I'm Audrey Scardina.
And I'm Sam Mills.
And today we're going to be presenting this paper to you titled Tackling 40 Years of the Kirkdale Archaeological Archive for HES.
So first off, we wanted to provide a definition of what is an archaeological archive, just so everyone's clear about what we're going to be talking about. So we've taken this definition from the Standard and Guide to Best Practice in Archaeological Archiving in Europe. And that defines an archaeological archive as consisting of two main elements. The documentary archive, consisting of the records and associated documentation created during the course of an archaeological project, so that's things like photos, plans, context sheets, things like that, and the materials and finds archives, which I'm sure you're all aware of. Additionally, we've defined the Kirkdale Archive as a legacy archive, and we've given this a definition of an archive that's over 10 years old, and or where the excavators have moved on in terms of career or company, and often that's both the case. In this paper, we're mostly going to be talking about the documentary archive, as that's often the more complicated process and the bit that doesn't get talked about as much. So a brief overview of the Kirkdale Archive project. So the Kirkdale Archive spans 40 years of archaeological projects in Scotland and elsewhere, in England and Wales, and even further afield. Overall, we've catalogued and packed over 10,000 unique items. Those items include plans, photographs, negatives, slides, paper sources like books, contact sheets, and field notes. On the right, you can see a picture of some plans being packed in an archive-safe folder. And obviously, we've also catalogued and processed all the finds via Treasure Trove, which is a way of processing finds in Scotland.
So one of the things we wanted to talk about is how a legacy or an archive becomes a legacy archive, because that is a question we get a lot in terms of this project, as in, why hasn't it been deposited previously? How does a legacy archive come to exist in the first place, etc. Well, the first point is that heritage bodies in Scotland and across the UK have changed, as have the regulations for depositing archives and archival material more generally. So the first projects that are part of the archive, the Kirkdale Archive, come from the late 1970s, and from then onwards, you can imagine over that period of time, a lot of things have changed. So it might be a case of a project having been started, and by the time that the kind of work is finished and the project has been written up, some of the guidance for how to deposit archives has changed, and that means that the way it was done in the excavation needs to be fixed, etc. The other thing is that methods of recording archaeological interventions have changed, and that leads to a diverse and complex record that needs to be condensed into the archive. So a great example of this is different photography formats. So when we first start out, we have a lot of negatives and contact sheets, and sometimes we have even large format negatives, which is something you kind of rarely see today, all the way through to completely digital photographs, although we have a weird transition where we have kind of film photos that are also on CDs, so we have that kind of wide breadth of material. Here on the right, you can see a photo, which is a Polaroid that was taken in the 1980s at an excavation. So at the time, this was probably kind of the height of kind of new methods in terms of recording material. But obviously, that's not something that lasted for a very long time. The other thing we get is multiple sites in older books. So if you have a site book, you might be reusing it if you've had two short excavations. Now, a lot of the times, the guidance is to deposit things by site, by intervention. So obviously that's something that we then have to deal with in terms of how we manage the older material. The thing that I think is probably the most relevant to the Kirkdale Archive is what happens when you do continuous work on a single site over a number of years, and how that can lead to a backlog of material that's been retained for referencing. So, for example, Kirkdale started working fairly consistently at Stirling Castle in the early 1990s and worked pretty much consistently from then up until the mid-2010s. And so even now we're often told with archives to not actually deposit the material until you're completely done with it. And so in this situation, we find ourselves in a place where the work was never completely done on Stirling Castle because the Kirkdale team was always going back and referencing previous excavations. And because of that, this material doesn't actually get turn into the archive because it's consistently in use. So we now want to talk about actually how we went through and did this entire thing, how we dealt with the material, just more generally. So the first thing we did is catalog the plans. So we started with plans, and it was really important for us to come up with a system that was consistent that we could use for, the entire project. And this was something that we were really assisted with, and kind of instrumental was the input of Dave Murray, who's one of the archaeologists at Kirkdale Archaeology, who also worked on the archive. Because he's worked on a lot of these sites and a lot of these projects, he was able to kind of talk about what he felt from the kind of excavator's perspective should be included in the catalog. So the first thing I'd like to highlight here that I think is quite important to the project is the KA number, or the Kirkdale Archive number. And that is the number that you see in the bottom right in the little triangle. So it says KA 0500. And we gave each unique item in the Kirkdale Archive a KA number. And that was a really great way of making sure that we weren't causing any confusion by having kind of multiple items with a single number or a single kind of code going with them. Although we did respect kind of the way that they were organized as well. And the other thing, so of course we made sure to do the research and include that information on each item in an archive-safe manner. And then the other thing is that very early on we decided to include the camera IDs and event IDs in the catalog. And this actually came from my having volunteered at the Royal Commission a couple of years previously, so I knew that the camera IDs existed. And because of that, we got in contact with Ian Fraser at Archives, and he said to us, he came in and we said, can we use these numbers? And he said, yes, but can you please also use the event ID? So each unique archaeological intervention should have an event ID, and you can be able to tag that in the catalog as well. So those were the two kind of main points that we started out with that I think make the Kirkdale Archive somewhat unique in terms of how we've gone about cataloging this. The other material that you're seeing here, just to go through it, is the bundle description. So for plans, this is the kind of way that the plans had been organized and grouped together from the excavation. So we wanted to respect that and have a reference to that. The site code, the camera ID, the event ID, the project year, the KA number, so the Kirkdale Archive number, and then the drawing number. So this is an important point about plans, actually, is that sometimes we'll have more than one drawing on a single sheet. And so in this instance, the sheet is the item. So the sheet gets a number, and the individual plans do not get numbers because their drawings do not get numbers because they already have their own drawing numbers that were recorded in the excavation. And so that's how you distinguish them. So drawing number, date of drawing, type of drawing, so in this case you're seeing mostly elevations and overlays, but obviously we also have things like plans and sections, etc. The specific location, and then the description. And it's worth noting that we have made sure to have a description for every single item in the archive as much as possible. Of course, we've modified this slightly for photographic records, slides, and paper records. For example, if we're looking at, what used to be a folder that came from an excavation, it might have, some field notes, some drawings, or sketches, basically, and then a list of context sheets. And so in that case, we would say it has those things, and context sheets, 0100 to 0235. And that information will be included in the catalog. This is just a quick visualization of what we were just speaking about. So here in this entry I have highlighted, we have the site ID, which you can see on the left here, and that's for the Stirling Castle Palace. And then underneath that in Canmore, you'll have all of the different events that relate to Stirling Castle Palace. And so under that will be this event ID for SPARC, which is the Stirling Castle Palace Archaeological and Historical Research Project. And in this case, it's a really long event ID. The project ran for a number of years, so from 2003 to 2006. But we can have all sorts of event IDs, so anywhere from this to intermittent events to very simple events that probably took a couple of hours, like a watching brief while interpretation boards were being installed into a castle or something like that. So event IDs are quite a kind of broad thing, but they all encompass all of the interventions that took place.
So why did we go into so much detail while creating our catalogue? So as an archive becomes further removed from its original creator and context, it's easy for details to get lost over time. Maybe pieces of the archive are lent out to people for research, maybe they get lost. Things like this, accidents happen. But detail gets lost over time. So our aim was to capture as much detail as possible in the process of creating an archive, which is why we did things like add a detailed description of every individual thing, and why having that tied to our KA number, so every item has its unique number, we're hoping that that information is not going to be lost and can always be brought back to a physical object. And by recording this level of detail, we also hope to have kind of made an archive much more accessible and slightly removed a barrier to entry. So for example, if someone wanted to look at the photos of the human remains from the army kitchen excavations at Stirling Castle in 1997, they could go to our catalogue, look at the photos, look at the descriptions of the photos, find out exactly which ones they wanted to look at in advance, and request that to see that from HES's archive, rather than having to just request the whole section of photos from that excavation and sort through them. So again, hoping to just make it a bit easier and remove a barrier to entry that maybe puts people off from using archive material. And then obviously, by tagging everything with a camera ID and event ID, this will all be linked in with camera and accessible to the public through there. So not just usable by academics or other archaeological units using it for research. Everyone can look at it. So what are some of the challenges we faced? As you can imagine, over 40 years of archaeological work, the methods of naming and recording sites in archaeology excavations have changed. One kind of example of this is the Stirling Castle Army Kitchen and Governor's Kitchen are the same site in the King's Old buildings in Stirling Castle. And they were just two names used at two different times. That can get even more confusing as there's a site in Stirling Castle called the Governor's House, which is not actually at all related to the Governor's Kitchen. They're completely separate buildings. And then what you can come across in legacy archives as well is physical objects that are not identifiable. So you find them and you don't know what they actually are of. So an example on the right here, this is some photos or negatives of Dunbar Castle, and these were at the end of a roll of film from photos of Dryburgh Abbey. So as we were going through this, we obviously saw them. They're not of Dryburgh Abbey, but there is no indication of what else they would be. In this case, we had our friend Will Wyeth, who's an expert in castles, look at these photos. He knew what Dunbar Castle looked like, and he was able to identify it. So we were then able to recontextualize these photos and give them back and put them correctly into the archive. Another great example of this is the Park of Tongland Standing Stones. These were in with a bunch of photos from Inchbury Abbey. This took quite a long time for us to re-identify, and we had a lot of help from Maya Hall and Adam Welfare from HES. But eventually we were able to identify this site and these photos. And what's really cool is by then finding a collaborating source in Discovery and Excavation Scotland, we were able to update the site ID, the camera site ID for this site. As previously it only stated it was a cairn, we were able to add that there are actually standing stones at this site as well. And these photos may be some of the only photos of this site before it's now in a different condition, basically, after an excavation. So that kind of just goes to show how important it is to recontextualize data and objects and give them back that context, because you may be finding information that would be completely missed otherwise. One thing we had to do a lot of as well is create new camera site IDs and event IDs for missing sites and areas, and I'll have an example of that in a second. And then, as I'm sure every archivist considers, is what should we put in this archive and what should we remove? And again, we're going to go over this a bit more detail in a second. So here's a quick example of creating some new camera site IDs. On the left, you can see a new site ID we created for the Stirling Castle Trance, which is a subterranean structure kind of running under the Great Hall. Previously, information for this this site was tagged to the Castle Upper Square, which it's not. It is a different thing. So obviously we had to create this site ID so information would be correctly tagged to the correct location. Another thing we had to do is Kirkdale Archaeology has done some work with UNESCO from the Cape Coast castles in Ghana. That information is now held by HES. And so we had to create 3 site IDs for those castles and forts.
Right, so Sam mentioned a second ago we had to decide what should go in an archive and shouldn't go in an archive. So yeah, we just wanted to touch on these kind of ethical issues in archaeological archives. And there are, of course, things that archivists consider more generally, but there are some issues that are maybe more specific to archaeology. So under HES's current guidelines, things like costings and personal correspondence shouldn't go into an archive for deposition. But then it's also looking at things like field notes relating to individual excavators or other people working on the project. And this is something we just have to think about because it might be a situation where we have a list of who was present on what days and who wasn't, but it might include personal information like phone numbers or whether someone was off sick, which maybe you wouldn't want to include in an archive. But then sometimes we also have an issue where on the other side of that sheet of paper we'll have a drawing that might be relevant to the archive. So it's thinking about making a judgment call and actually thinking about it, not just saying, oh, of course this goes in because it has the plan on it. We also have to think about things like outdated methodologies utilized by archaeologists still working in the field. So maybe at the time that the methodologies were used, they were, top scientific methods, but they're out of date now. And would that be potentially embarrassing to somebody if that information went into the National Archive? It's also things like maybe somebody worked on an excavation when they were a lot younger and kind of had a habit of doodling things on their plans. And, if there's a possibility of removing that material without it being a problem with the archive, maybe we would want to do that rather than including it. Although obviously a lot of times with plans, that material has to go in. The thing that I think is really relevant to archaeological archives that maybe doesn't get thought about enough is photos of excavators. So, a lot of times you'll have somebody taking photos of the trenches and then they'll do kind of a pan up and take a picture of everyone excavating. And maybe people weren't aware that their photograph was being taken in that moment. Now, sometimes we actually need that for the context of where the trenches are. So again, because of this kind of time depth, we might have a difficulty understanding exactly where the trench in the photograph was being taken, and the only photo we have that gives us the context is the one with people in it. But at the same time, sometimes that material or information is present. And maybe, someone making a goofy face, we don't want to just put that in and then have it in the National Archive forever. So we just have to think about that kind of thing. And I think actually something that came up that was interesting for us is there was a point where Kirkdale was doing some excavations at Melrose Abbey. And they had a student group come through, and we had pictures of the archaeologists interacting with the student group, which of course are really great for Kirkdale's personal records, but we don't know what permissions were given from the student group in terms of photographs, and so it's maybe not appropriate, again, to put that into the National Archive. So in that case, because they weren't, archaeological photographs specifically, we removed those photos. Just generally, we think that archaeologists need to be aware that they're part of the archiving process. So when they're sitting there taking photos of the excavation, think about the fact that you might be handing these into, the National Archive. So maybe taking a goofy picture of your friend and not deleting it for the kind of handing in the archive, or, taking a picture of the site cat that's wandering around, that kind of thing. We need to kind of keep that in mind. I also think we need to keep in mind what materials we're actually keeping in the archive, in terms of maybe you're a different person working on organizing the material to be handed in than the person that did it. So yeah, again, thinking, would the person who wrote these notes actually want them to go into the archive? Especially if you know them, you can maybe make a better judgment call. And it's also the same for yourself. I mean, perhaps in the moment you're thinking, oh, this funny comment I've made where I've written some swear words in the corner of my notes. Well, that's fine, whatever. But maybe in 10 years you'll be slightly embarrassed when a student of yours finds that, or something like that. So we have a good example of this to the side here. These are some notes on the Dukes in Stirling Castle Palace. And, as you can see, I think the archaeologist here was having a bit of fun in terms of titling their little set of notes, Dukin for Dukes. And in this case, actually, the material that's presented in the notes is very relevant and very interesting in terms of how it relates to the rest of the Stirling Castle Palace archive and archaeological material. And so I think in this case, we just kind of have to hope, and I'd like to think that the archaeologists would be quite happy that Duking for Dukes has made it into our presentation. And so it is something that's in the end been included in the archive.
So thank you all for listening, and special thanks to everyone who's been involved in the project over the last 6 years. And then an extra special thanks on top of that to Gordon Newitt, the director of Kirkdale Archaeology, and Richard Strachan from HES for supporting and allowing this project to continue over the last 6 years.
Yeah, I'm just going to go through everyone really quickly. So, of course, Gordon, 2 archaeologists that work for Kirkdale who also worked on the archive, Dave Murray and Paul Fox, to Danielle Howarth and Joanna Witzkowska, who were a big part of the cataloging and packaging process for Kirkdale, to Kate Shoup and Sheena Books, who worked on the original cataloging of the plans and some of the finds, Owen Godbert, another archaeologist at Kirkdale who helped with some of the finds, Ian and Callum at Blackford Garage for giving us access to the store and kind of helping us when necessary with a variety of things. And then the teams at Historic Scotland, so to, of course, Richard and his colleague Adrian Cox, who have been the ones working on the project with us, to Ian Fraser and Richard Craig from Physical Archives, Maya Houle for a variety of reasons, but especially her time in digital archives, Peter McKeague for everything relating to Canmore and always having answers, Andrew Nicol from Archives, Hannah Smith from Digital Archives, Judith Rowett and Rona Walker from Collections, and the Johnson Clare House Library team, who have answered many questions and led us into many spaces and whatnot. And of course, to anybody else we've forgotten that has helped with the project, thanks again. Thanks.
Thank you.